Okay, Boker Tov, good morning, everybody. We're continuing our study of Melachim Aleph. We're beginning chapter 8, Perek Chet today. This chapter, I would say, is probably the climax of Shelomo HaMelech's entire reign over the Jewish people. The temple has been completed. We went through painstaking description and detail in the last few chapters of all of the intricacies of the building of the temple, the different utensils, the format, the layout, the metalwork, the gold work, the opulence of it, and so on and so forth. Now we're ready to get to the heart of what it all means for us. We have this beautiful, beautiful structure, but what does it mean for the Jewish people? And here's where Shelomo's inauguration of the Beit HaMikdash is so critical for us to be able to understand what's the goal and function of the Beit HaMikdash in the hearts of the Jewish people. What should we be thinking about relating to it? And for us reading it without the presence of the temple, what should we perhaps be pining for a return to? What is it that we want, yearn for with the rebuilding and restoration of the Beit HaMikdash? So Shelomo will give us some insight here in his inauguration. So let's begin by reading Pasuk Aleph of chapter 8. Az yakhel Shelomo et ziknei Israel. Then Shelomo convoked the elders of Israel. He gathered, yakhel from the language of kahal, like a congregation, or lahakil means to gather. Et kol rashi hamatot. He gathered all of the elders and the heads of the tribes, nesi'eh ha'avot livnei Israel, the ancestral chieftains of the Israelites, el hamelech Shelomo Yerushalayim. They gathered together towards the king Shlomo in Jerusalem. Leha'alot et Aron berit Adonai me'ir David hi Tzion, in order to ascend, to bring up the Ark of the Covenant of God from the city of David, which is Tzion, right? That's its nickname. That's what it's called. So remember that the whole purpose of building the Beit HaMikdash, what motivated David in the first place was when he brought the Aron HaKodesh back from the Pelishtim to Jerusalem, it didn't have a place to go. He said, here I am in a beautiful home, and God does, his ark lies in curtains, doesn't have a permanent resting spot. So there's emphasis here in the very first pasuk on the Aron HaKodesh. Notice the opening words of the chapter. Az yakhel Shelomo. Does that remind you of any other phrase that sometimes opens a very dramatic scene? Az Yashir. It sounds very similar to Az Yashir Moshe. Az yakhel Shelomo. Something amazing has happened. In the case of Moshe, was the splitting of the sea, which showed the hand of God. In the case of Shelomo, it's the building of the Beit HaMikdash. And now somebody is going to bring together people to pronounce the glory of Hashem. It gives you a little bit of a hint towards where Shelomo's inauguration is going. The purpose of his inauguration is very similar to the purpose of Moshe and the Jewish people singing the Song of the Sea after the momentous miracle of God of splitting the sea. It's about to give glory and honor and praise to Hashem. Verse 2. Vayikahalu el hamelech Shelomo kol ish Yisrael. Towards the king Shelomo gathered all of the men of Israel. Beyerach ha'etanim behag. In the month of Etanim, on the Chag, on the festival, hu hachodesh hashevi'i. That is the 7th month. So when is the inauguration taking place? The 7th month is Tishrei, the same month as Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Here it tells us it's happening b'Chag, on the festival. What is the reference to the festival? Actually, Sukkot. It's Sukkot. Although I think there's a bit of a discussion here. I see that she brings something here. Yeah, it's the 7th month, the month of Tishrei. And generally, it's assumed that we're talking about Bachag is on the holiday of Sukkot. Momentarily, we'll see a little bit more language that actually in that year, Shelomo suspended Yom Kippur. There was no observance of Yom Kippur. He removed it. They did 2 weeks worth of festivities, and it overrode the observance of the day of Yom Kippur. That's how the rabbis bring the tradition. It was a temporary suspension, which Shelomo, being the king, has the power to do that. You can, as a leader, as a prophet, and as a lawmaker, temporarily suspend a mitzvah for a certain purpose. And so it seems Shelomo had permission to do that. Pasuk Gimel. Vayavo'u kol ziknei Yisrael vayis'u hakohanim et ha'aron. When all the elders of Israel had come, the priests lifted the ark. Verse 4, Vaya'alu et Aron Adonai ve'et ohel mo'ed ve'et kol keleh hakodesh asher ba'ohel. They carried up the ark of God. The priests and the Leviim brought the tent of meeting, the ohel mo'ed. That's a phrase we haven't seen in a very long time. Ohel mo'ed is the tent of meeting that Moshe used all those years ago in the desert, right? Remember, we're almost 5 centuries since the Jewish people have been in the desert, yet they must have preserved the ohel mo'ed, the tent of Moshe, had remained, and they brought that to the Beit HaMikdash together with all of the utensils. They're bringing the Mishkan, the Ohel Moed, all of the other artifacts that we've had. Vaya'alu otam hakohanim v'alviim, and they were brought up by the priests and the Leviim. Verse 5, V'hamelech Shelomo v'chol adat Yisrael hanoadim alav ito lefnei ha'aron mezabechim tzon ubakar asher lo yisaferu v'lo yimanu merov. Meanwhile, Shelomo and the whole community of Israel who were assembled with him before the ark were sacrificing sheep and oxen and other cattle in such abundance that they could not be numbered or counted. Remember, David did something similar. Remember, it took David 2 tries to get the Aron back to the city of Yerushalayim. The first time he did it, if you think back into your memories of Shemuel Bet, the first time he did it in chapter 6 of Shemuel Bet, remember the Aron wobbled and somebody tried to hold it, Uzzah, and he died, and David got freaked out. He took the Aron and he stashed it away. They didn't do it the right way the first time. Then the second time they did it, David brought it up, and every 6 steps that they took, they sacrificed another animal on their way up to the Beit HaMikdash to show on the way up to Yerushalayim with the Aron, to show reverence and awe for the Aron. So it seems that Shlomo learned from his father, that when you're bringing the Aron, when you're transporting the Aron, there has to be a level of deference over here. And as a result, the community is sacrificing constantly while the Aron is being carried up to be installed in the Beit HaMikdash. Verse 6, Vayaviu hakohanim et Aron berit Adonai el mekomo, el devir habayit el kodesh hakodashim. The priests brought the Aron of God, the berit of God's covenant, to its place underneath the wings of the Kiruvim, those massive angelic figures that Shelomo had built. They placed the Aron underneath it in the shrine of the house, in the devir of the Kodesh HaKodashim, in the Holy of Holies. El tachat kanfei HaKiruvim, under the wings of the Kiruvim. Verse 7, Ki HaKiruvim poresim kenafayim el mekom ha'aron. For the Kiruvim had their wings spread out over the place of the ark. Vayasoku HaKiruvim al ha'aron ve'al badav milmala, so that the Kiruvim shielded the ark and its poles from above, almost to show God's presence sort of hovering like an eagle over its people to protect them. Verse 8, Vaya'arichu habadim vayera'u rasheh habadim min hakodesh al penei hadevir. The poles projected so that the end of the poles were visible in the sanctuary in front of the shrine. In other words, the poles were so long and the space was not big enough that they protruded a little bit out. They pushed out a little bit to the point where people could visible. If you were outside in the Hechal, you could see it jabbing out, right? In front of the shrine. But they could not be seen outside. So they could be seen like with a dent, but not physically from the outside. And they remained there to this day. That's obviously not a phrase for us today, but it means that Yirmiyahu, when he was writing it that they remained there to that day. That's how they did. The Badim, the poles, were never meant to be taken out or removed from the Aron. Even in the times of the Mishkan, when it went from place to place, it was not to be removed. And even though here it's permanent and it's not going anywhere, so you might say, what do we need the poles for? Right? The poles are meant to be able to carry it from place to place. What do we need the poles for? Nevertheless, the Torah has a rule: the poles have to remain inside of the ark, unique to the ark. All the other utensils had poles to transfer them from place to place, but then when you got to the resting spot, the poles were taken out. In the case of the Aron, the poles always remained. Maybe the idea that the Aron, which represents Torah, is meant to move from place to place, always meant to be soaked up and learned from wherever you might be.
Now, we read about the other Kiruvim that were abandoned. Now, where is this in?
So I think we asked this question before: what happened to the original Kiruvim that were there? It doesn't really say explicitly, but the fact that there's an omission maybe suggests that those Kiruvim still stayed on the Aron, as it were, and then they were simply installed underneath these more gigantic Aron, Keruvim, which were wing to wing. Exactly. Yeah, that's what I would say. Okay. Verse 9. En ba'aron rak shne luchot ha'avanim asher hiniach sham Moshe bechorev. There was nothing inside the Ark of the Covenant but the 2 tablets of stone which Moshe placed there at Chorev. Chorev is another name for Har Sinai. Asher karat Adonai im bnei Israel betzeta me'eretz Mitzrayim, which was the covenant that God had cut with the Jewish people, had made agreement with them after their departure from Eretz Mitzrayim. So the text tells us that the Aron housed the luchot, the tablets that were given to Moshe on Har Sinai, were stashed inside of the Aron HaKodesh. Nothing else was there. There is some debate, however. The Gemara says, what happened to the first set of tablets that Moshe had received that he had broken? So rabbinic tradition has it that the broken pieces of the first set of luchot were also gathered by Moshe and placed side by side to the second set of luchot, which remained whole, always to remind the Jewish people about the sin of the golden calf and what the damage could be, but also to remind the people about the fact that there's a lack of perfection, right? There's the first luchot were carved by God and written by God, almost too difficult for the human being to bear. So the second set, which was carved by God, Moshe, but written on by God, a little bit more of a balance between the two. The Gemara in Masechet Berachot has a nice lesson that it learns from that. It says you put the broken pieces of the luchot together with the whole pieces of the luchot. What's the message? That even if you have a person who learned a lot of Torah in their life, and then at the end of their life they got old and they forgot it, right? Or God forbid they had some kind of a mental breakdown or something like that, or a dementia. So you still have to give them the same honor that they had when they knew the knowledge as much as they do when they don't know the knowledge anymore. In other words, I think the message is that it's not necessarily about retaining your knowledge throughout life. It's the effort and the process that a person goes through to study Torah and incorporate those values into their life. So if a person studied Torah their whole life and was a tremendous scholar, and then for whatever reason their life turned and they were unable to retain that level of scholarship, do not dismiss them or say or disrespect them. The broken luchot are right next to the whole luchot. That's sort of the symbolism that's being mentioned there. But that's it. There's another discussion about the fact that there was a shelf that was built outside of the Aron, which also held the final Torah of Moshe that he wrote for the Jewish people, and the jar of man. Moshe, when the Jewish people received man for the first time, God told him, take a jar and put a portion of man in there that will always serve as a reminder for the Jewish people that God provided them food in the desert, the man. And so some rabbis maintain that was stashed next to the Aron HaKodesh, like on a shelf that protruded out from it. So even though the text tells us here that it's only the luchot, it seems rabbinic tradition has a couple of other objects that also give us a major representation that are either inside, next to, or near the Aron. Let's continue.
Wait, I have a question.
Yes.
Wasn't it also the sticks of Aharon that flourish? Was that
the stick of Aharon with the almonds?
You know what I'm talking about?
Yes, that was after the Korach rebellion.
Didn't it put those?
Staff is told to be placed in the Kodesh HaKodashim to determine he's the true Kohen, and his staff sprouts almonds to make a sign to everybody that he was correct in being chosen as the Kohen. Was that stashed next to the Aron HaKodesh? Quite possibly. I could be forgetting. I'll double check again. It could be another one of those objects that was held on to from the time of the Midbar and preserved to remember certain ideas and stories that took place for the Jewish people in the desert. Absolutely.
But it's interesting. It's interesting that with all these other things, it like very specifically only says that the Aron, the tablets were the only thing in there, yet there's like all these other things that could have been in there. But like, why bother with that like statement that it was the only thing in there when it really might not have been?
It really might not have been, right? So like, why say it's the only thing? Maybe it was the most important thing. That's the thing that our mind should be on. The rabbis over here in the Gemara, I just pulled it up on the screen in front of you. I'll read it for those who don't see the screen. The Gemara in Baba Batra says that there's a double negative over here. En ba'aron, there's nothing in the aron, rak, but except for this. So the rabbis kind of say when there's like a double negative, it's hinting to you that there's something else that's also there as well. And that's what they used to learn, that abot sefer Torah shemunach ba'aron, that there was also the Torah of Moshe that was placed alongside the Luchot in the Aron as well. I'm wondering if there are other commentaries who make note of the fact that there were other things in the Aron as well. I'm doing a quick search here, but I'm not sure if I'm going to find any. So the Radak disagrees with a little bit what we're saying, if I see it correctly here. The Radak says, Zera'aya, this pasuk is proof, Ki lo hayu ba'aron, lo shivre luchot ve'lo sefer Torah. Inside the Aron were not the broken pieces of the tablets, nor the sefer Torah of Moshe. Va'aron shebo sefer Torah nir'a ki netanuhu be'otzarot bet Hashem im ohel moed ve'im ha'kerim. There must have been a second Aron, according to the Radak, where they put all of these other things. It seems that there were multiple Aron HaKodesh, and this one that went into the Kodesh HaKodashim was just the Luchot, nothing else. And there may have been a second Aron which had other things as well. וכן נראה מדברי חלקיהו הכהן ספר תורה שמצאתי בבית השם, נראה כי לא היה במקום שהיו רגילים בו ולא היו יודעים אותו שם באותו הדור. Interesting that the Radak references a story that we're going to see later in the book of Kings 2. It's a story of a Kohen who finds the Sefer Torah of Moshe. He finds it, and it says he found it bebet Hashem, in the house of God. Well, if the Sefer Torah of Moshe was right next to the Luchot in the Aron, doesn't mean he found it. Everybody knows where it is, right? The fact that he quote unquote found it shows you that they had put it somewhere else, and not everybody was aware of where that Sefer Torah may have been, which again lends evidence to the Radak's claim that that Sefer Torah was not there. So there seems to be a bit of a debate amongst the rabbis. Were there other objects, most notably the Sefer Torah of Moshe, that were placed next to the Aron or in the Aron, or was it just the Luchot, as the simple reading of the text over here says? So there's probably a lot more we can explore on that, but I don't want to get too bogged down beyond that. If I find anything else, I will certainly present it in our other classes. Let's go to 10 and 11 to wrap up this little section about the Aron, and then we get to Moshe's Shelomo's verbal inauguration. Verse 10, Vahi betzeta kohanim min hakodesh, ve'he'anan male et bet Adonai. When the priests came out of the sanctuary, the cloud had filled the house of God. And as a result, in verse 11, V'lo yachelu hakohanim la'amod l'sharet b'penei ha'anan. The kohanim were not able to stand and serve in the inside of the sanctified areas because of the cloud of God, which was a representation of God's divine presence. Himale kevod Adonai et bet Adonai, for the honor and glory of God had filled up the house of God. This is something that we find as well in the Mishkan. After the Mishkan was inaugurated, the pasuk also says that Aharon, Moshe, and his children could not enter the Mishkan because the divine presence in the form of a cloud filled up the sanctified areas. This is basically a sign that God desired what they did. God was giving like his stamp of approval on what Shelomo had done, just like he did with what the Jewish people had done. The fact that God makes a physical manifestation of his divine presence filling up that sanctified area shows that he's pleased, so to speak, with what the Jewish people, and in this case Shelomo, have done. And then eventually God's presence will be lifted and the Jewish people will be able to come in and serve Hashem. Okay, so that takes care of the section that deals with the Aron and the physical inauguration of the Beit HaMikdash, and the divine presence coming down into the sanctuary is significant to show God's approval of everything that had been done to this point. Questions, comments on this first section of chapter 8? Excellent. We're now ready to move to the next section, which is going to be Shelomo's verbal inauguration, his prayer, Tefillat Shelomo, to Hashem on the very first time that people are able to serve and pray to Hashem in the Beit HaMikdash. One thing that I want you to pay attention to is the emphasis that Shelomo places on prayer. And the reason why I want you to pay attention to that is it's commonly thought of about the Bet HaMikdash, that what makes the Bet HaMikdash the most important place is the ability to serve Hashem through sacrifices, through korbanot. And the answer is yes. Korbanot plays a prominent role in the Bet HaMikdash. That's where the altar is. No sacrifices can be done outside of the temple. The temple service through the animal sacrifices and the incense and the menorah is a critical part to the Bet HaMikdash. But interestingly enough, Shelomo will downplay that part of the Bet HaMikdash and will upplay, I don't know if that's a word, but he will play up, thank you, he will play up, right? He will play up prayer, which tells us something very important. It tells us that in Shelomo's mind, the most important part of the Bet HaMikdash is the fact that it's a place where people can come to pray. Yes, it will be a place where people come to serve, and korbanot, like I said, is a major aspect of the Bet HaMikdash. But in Shelomo, the architect, the founder of the temple, in his mind, it's first and foremost a place of prayer, right? It not just maintained, that's how the connection is created. In other words, service and sacrifices is a physical manifestation of our relationship. But sacrifices without the heart, without the prayer aspect, are simply empty procedures, right? You're not going through the deeper, more spiritual and emotional elements of creating a relationship with God if it's not about prayer. And again, I want to tell you why I emphasize this so much, because we get taught very later on that prayer is a replacement for the fact that we don't have sacrifices. I'm sure many people have heard that sentiment, which in people's minds tells them that there was no prayer until the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed, right? That the Bet HaMikdash was built and we're just giving animal sacrifices all day long without praying. And only when the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed did all of a sudden prayer become an important part, because it was there to replace it. That's a gross misunderstanding. As you will see from Shelomo's words, prayer is the start. Prayer has always been there. Prayer was there in the times of our forefathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, well before there was any central place for worship and service and sacrifices. So sacrifices became the way we physically manifest our service to Hashem, and they're very important, but they were never the prime focus without prayer. Prayer has always and will always be there. It is the most primal form of developing a relationship with Hashem. What we mean when we say that prayer replaced sacrifice, it means that when we lost sacrifice, prayer took on an even greater significance, having not had the actual service to supplement together with prayer. Now prayer becomes our only tool to connect with God, whereas then it was a partnership between prayer and sacrifice. That's what I think is very important to emphasize, that evolution, so that we don't think for a moment that prayer wasn't always a consistent part of a Jewish life. Questions or thoughts on that? Yeah. Daily. The Bet HaMikdash is in use daily. Right, so 3 times a year we have a unique commandment for everybody to come and to appear in the Bet HaMikdash, to offer sacrifices, to be festive, to celebrate the holidays. Clearly, people came to the temple during the course of the year to present whatever personal sacrifices they need to bring, offerings to the Kohanim, donations that they may have. If they committed a transgression and they needed atonement, they would bring sacrifices. And there were communal sacrifices that were daily. There were communal sacrifices that were brought periodically throughout the year. And there were private sacrifices that people offered, both mandatory and voluntary. So the Bet HaMikdash was in operation and in use 365 days a year. Absolutely. Right? So even if a person was not attending the Bet HaMikdash daily with sacrifices, there was always prayer, there were always synagogues, there was always a concept of building a relationship. What there wasn't in the time of the first Bet HaMikdash was some of the formality that we experience with prayer. There was always a concept to pray. There was always the mitzvah of prayer. According to the Rambam, the mitzvah of prayer is a biblical commandment. When we say in Shema every day, to serve God with all your heart, The rabbis say, what does it mean to serve God with all your heart? What's service of the heart? Service of the heart is prayer. So prayer has always been a constant. What didn't happen in the time of the first temple was some of the formal natures of prayer that we have today. It was not a requirement to pray 3 times a day. It could have been 1 time a day or whenever you felt like you wanted to pray. It was very informal when a person wanted to pray. The language of prayer was in the hands of the person, whatever he wanted to say, sort of however he wanted to say it. There wasn't the rigid sort of framework that we have today that our rabbis really came about instituting more during the Second Temple period. It was Ezra and his court that when they returned back to Israel to build the second Beit HaMikdash, decided to institute formal blessings, formal 3 times a day prayers, a language and text to that prayer, and more rigid laws about how a person went about fulfilling prayer. That seemed to happen a little later. Yirmiyahu was in the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. Oh, Minyan. There always seems to be a concept from the Nevi'im about praying with people, but I would say as well, formal minyan with these types of prayers that we have today probably was not mandatory necessarily until it became more formalized in the Second Temple period. Okay, so that's just a nice overview of tefillah. And now that you have that background, I think it'll make the next Pesukim that we're going to read on Shelomo's prayer in the Beit HaMikdash all the more meaningful. Verse 12. Az amar Shelomo Adonai amar lishkon ba'arafel. Then Shelomo declared in prayer, the Lord has chosen to abide in a thick cloud. Verse 13. Bano baniti bet zevulach. I have now built for you a stately home. Machon leshivtecha olamim. A place where you may dwell forever. That's ironic that it says olamim. In other words, the intention is forever, but unfortunately, we will realize that that won't be the case. Although some people might read it as, in the end, no matter what, from that point on, the presence of God will always be there. The house might not always be there, but the presence will always be there. And that is how we maintain, by the way. We do maintain that the divine presence still rests on the Temple Mount, which is why even to go today to the Temple Mount is not a simple thing. Widely debated, highly contested, because those areas are still considered sanctified with the same kedusha, the same holiness that they had when the Beit HaMikdash stood. The edifice might not stand, but the holiness remains. So it could be that Shlomo is referring to the holiness, the sanctity, which will be eternal. Worth noting the phrase machon leshivtecha, a place where you may dwell. Those words also take us back to Shirat Hayam, Az Yashir. We say machon leshivtecha pa'alta Adonai. Mikedash Adonai konenu yadecha. Those words, machon leshivtecha, were uttered by the Jewish people after the splitting of the sea as a foreshadowing to their goal of eventually building a dwelling place for Hashem in the land of Israel. Let's go to verse 14. Vayasev hamelech et panav. The king then turned his face. Vayvarech et kol kehal Yisrael, and he blessed the entire nation of the Jewish people. V'chol kehal Yisrael omed, and all of the Jewish people were standing. This is because there is no sitting in the temple area. When one visits the temple and stays in the temple proper, there was only standing. There are no chairs, there's no benches, it's only standing. The only person who's permitted to sit in the temple is the king himself. And even the kings very often did not sit. Otherwise, everybody stood. Correct. Yeah. Verse 14. Vayasev hamelech, we read that one. Verse 15. Vayomer, Shelomo says, Baruch Adonai Elohei Israel. Blessed is God, the Lord of Israel. Asher diber befiv et David avi, who spoke with his word to David, my father. Uviado milel lemor, and who has fulfilled his promise and his deeds with David. For what did God say? Verse 16. Min hayom asher hotzeti et ami et Israel mimitzrayim. God said to David, from the day that I have taken the Jewish people out of Egypt, Lo baharti be'ir mikol shivtei Israel. I had not chosen any city from amongst the tribes of Israel. Livnot bayit lihiyot shemi sham, to build a home, a dwelling place for my name to reside there. Va'evchar beDavid, but I chose David lihiyot al ami Israel, to be the leader upon my nation Israel. Verse 17. Vayi im levav David avi livnot bayit l'shem Adonai Elohei Israel. Now my father David had intended in his heart to build a house for the name of God, the God of Israel. Verse 18, Shelomo is going through the history of how we got to this point of the building of the Beit HaMikdash. Yomer Adonai el David Avi, God said to David, my father, Ya'an asher haya im levavecha livnot bayit lishmi, because it was in your intentions, in your heart, to build a home for me. Hetivota ki haya im levavecha. You have done the right thing. You have had the right intentions. Hetivota, you have done good. However, verse 19, Rak ata lo tivneh habayit. God had told David, you are not going to be the one to build the house. Ki im bincha hayotzeh mehalatzecha. Rather, the child, your son, who comes from your loins, hu yivneh habayit lishmi. He will be the one to build the home in my name. Verse 20, Vayakem Adonai et devaro asher diber. God has now this day fulfilled his promise to my father. Va'akum tahat David avi. I have now risen in place of David my father. Va'eshev al kisei Yisrael. And I have sat upon the throne of Israel. Ka'asher diber Adonai. Just as God had predicted and promised. Va'evneh habayit. I built the home. L'shem Adonai Elohei Yisrael. In the name of God, the Lord of Israel. Verse 21, Va'asim sham makom la'aron. I placed the Aron in its spot. I made a place for the Aron. Asher sham berit Adonai, where the covenant of God resides. Asher karat im avotenu behotzi'o otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, which God had made that covenant with our forefathers when he took them out of Egypt. This section is basically a historical recount and summary of how we got to the point of building the Beit HaMikdash. But it's more important than that because it's Shelomo's way of honoring his father. It's making sure that the legacy of David is not forgotten by the people, reminding the nation. This is part of his blessing to the people. It's part of his speech, his inaugural speech of the Beit HaMikdash, to remind the people of how we got to this point and how David, his father, was vindicated with all of the challenges that he had to deal with. God fulfilled his promise to David and helped his son to build the Beit HaMikdash. Shelomo is basically lending the credit to the building of the Beit HaMikdash to his father David and taking it away from him. He's simply the fulfillment of something that God had already promised to David, who was the one who earned that promise. Questions on that section? You wish you were there, don't we all? It could possibly be, our rabbis do say that every soul was present when the Torah was given at Har Sinai. And that's to remind us that even though we come later, the covenant that was made at Har Sinai was also made with us present there. Maybe there's an element of that as well in the case of the Beit HaMikdash, which we saw many similarities between the event of Har Sinai and the building of the Beit HaMikdash. Perhaps there's an idea of that as well. Verse 22. Then Shelomo stood before the altar of God in the presence of the whole community. And he spread his palms to the heavens. That action of spreading your palms to the heavens is synonymous with what? Kohanim to a degree. Good, that's one. And he is blessing the people. So that kind of fits.
Prayer.
Moshe, it's prayer, right? It's prayer, right? We find that when Paro asked Moshe to take away the plagues, it says, "Vayifros kapav el Adonai." He spread his hands to God. This is a motion, a classic motion of prayer. So it's interesting. Shelomo stands before the altar, and when you hear the word altar, you're expecting to have what? Sacrifice, but no. Before anything, he turns his attention to prayer to God, right? I think again, emphasizing the points that I brought up before. Verse 23, Vayomar, Shelomo declares again, Adonai Elohei Yisrael en kamocha Elohim. God, the Lord of Israel, there was no God like you. Bashamayim mima'al, in the heavens above, ve'al ha'aretz mitachat, and on the land below. You're hearing echoes of Alenu l'shabeach, that maybe we say every single day, which Alenu l'shabeach, that we say at the end of our prayers, was a prayer that was penned by none other than Moshe Rabbeinu. So Shelomo is certainly borrowing from that text as well, right? You are a God on high and on below. Shomer haberit v'hachesed. You are the observer and keepsake of the covenant and kindness. La'avadecha ha'olchim lefanecha. To your servants who walk before you, b'chol libam, with all devotion and commitment. Verse 24, Asher shamarta le'avdecha David avi. You observed and fulfilled your promise to your servant David, my father. Et asher dibarta lo, that which you had promised to him. V'tedaber beficha u'v'yadecha mileta kayom hazeh. And you spoke to him with your mouth, right? In other words, you spoke to him your words, and it was in your hand to fulfill the promise as it has been fulfilled today. Verse 25, Ve'ata Adonai Elohei Yisrael, and now God, the Lord of Israel, Shemor le'avdecha David avi et asher dibarta lo lemor. Continue to fulfill and observe to your servant, your faithful servant David, my father, that which you have told him. What is part of that promise? Lo yikaret lecha ish milefanai yoshev al kisei Yisrael. Your line on the throne of Israel shall never end. In other words, Shelomo is using this opportunity to pray that the lineage of David sitting on the throne of the Jewish people will continue. But again, only if they shall observe, your children shall observe their ways, the proper ways, to walk before you, as you have walked before me. So even Shelomo in his prayer to God saying, allow the lineage of David to continue to sit on the throne of the Jewish people, continues the conditional nature of this promise. The promise is conditional that they observe the laws of the Torah and keep the Jewish people on track to observe those laws as well. Verse 26, Ve'ata Elohei Yisrael, and now therefore God of Israel, Ye'amena devarecha asher dibarta, that the promise that you made to your servant, my father David, be fulfilled. Devarecha asher dibarta le'avdecha David avi. Verse 27, Ki ha'umnam yeshev Elohim al haaretz. But will God, right? This is a very important pasuk. Pasuk 27 is one to highlight. Says Shelomo, Ha'umnam yeshev Elohim al haaretz. Is it really possible for God to dwell upon the land? In other words, what Shelomo is saying, the heavens and the heavens of the heavens do not sustain God, nor will this house sustain him either. What Shelomo is trying to articulate here is the idea that nobody should falsely think that the house of God, the Bet HaMikdash that he has built, somehow limits God, that somehow God is here only and nobody else, as if we have bottled God up to a designated spot. Says Shelomo, no such thing, right? The heavens and the heavens of the heavens do not sustain God, cannot hold God. God is not physical. He's not limited. He doesn't have one locale. He's not present in one spot, right? Exactly, right? We've said before many times in history, in the time of Eli HaKohen, the obsession with the Aron was an obsession with the fact that they didn't believe they could be victorious, that Hashem's presence could be with them without having the Aron HaKodesh together with them in the battle, causing them to make some very bad errors of judgment in bringing the Aron with them when they shouldn't have. Shelomo is trying to say it's a wonderful thing that we have this Bet HaMikdash. It's a place for us as human beings to congregate and serve Hashem. It's a place where God's sanctity, his presence, is more easily palpable, more easily felt. But do not, as a human being, for 1 minute think that God somehow is limited just to this place, that somehow he's restricted within these four walls, and beyond that, God does not exist. No such thing. It would be blasphemy for a person to suggest such a thing. It's almost what Shelomo is basically telling us. There's a philosophical paradox with building a house for Hashem. It's almost impossible. How could you build a house for God? That's limiting him, right? It's not possible. So Shelomo is saying that's not what we're doing over here. All of us can recognize, speaking to the entire Jewish people, that this is not a house that is meant to limit God. It is simply for us as human beings to more clearly experience the divine presence and serve Hashem and connect to Hashem through this. I think it's a very important message. Why? It's very important. It's exactly to make sure that people understand. Exactly. To make sure, as Rabbi points out, that the people understand Judaism is not dependent on the house. The house is dependent on Judaism. In other words, Judaism asks you to build this house in order to be able to serve Hashem. But without the house, Judaism can continue, which is a very important message that resonates with us generations that have lived after the temple has been destroyed, right? We could still serve Hashem. We could still connect to God. We feel as though we've lost a major conduit to us towards our relationship with God and a connection with Hashem, but we're not abandoned by God and have no other resources. Additionally, I'll add another point. It could become very easy for people to then compartmentalize the aspects of their life. In other words, I have a house that I go to when I want to be connected to God, and then what I do outside of that house is my business, right? God is in the temple, God is in the synagogue, God is in these holy places, and we close the door and we leave God there. And then when I go to my house and I go to my business and I go to the park, it's separate, right? Shelomo wants to take away, again, that possible thought as well. Just because this is where we come to serve Hashem, doesn't mean that Hashem does not have his presence everywhere that we are, right? That we're not always in front of God and have to observe his laws and live by his principles wherever it is that we may be. Just because we have this place to go to serve Hashem, to feel more connected, doesn't limit other places and the connection we can create with Hashem there as well. So I think Shelomo wants to right away at the very onset take away certain dangers that could start to creep in to the minds of the Jewish people once they see a physical structure that's called the house of God, right? I think that's very important, right? Very necessary. Verse 28, we'll read a couple more Pesukim, and I just want to take a little peek here. Probably read till 34. We won't finish the chapter today, but we'll finish up this little section over here. We are up to verse 28, right? Okay, verse 28, here comes the emphasis on prayer. Ufanita el tefilat avdecha ve'el tehinato Adonai Elohai. Yet turn, O Lord my God, to the prayer and supplication of your servant. Lishmoa el harina ve'el hatefila. And hear the song and cry and prayer. Asher avdecha mitpalel lefanecha hayom. That your servant is offering before you today. Shelomo is going to make now a dramatic prayer to God to create the foundation of prayer in the temple. Verse 29, Liyot enecha fetuchot el habayit hazeh laila vayom. May your eyes, God, be open day and night towards this house. El hamakom asher amarta yehi shemi sham. For the place of which you have said, my name shall abide there. Lishmoa el hatefila, in order that you should listen to the prayer. Asher yitpalel avdecha el hamakom hazeh, that your servant will pray in this spot. And I think your servant here, he's referring to himself, but anybody could put themselves in that situation as well. Anytime a person comes to the Beit HaMikdash to pray, they should view themselves as avdecha, as the servant of God. Verse 30, V'shama'ata el techinat avdecha ve'amecha Yisrael, and asher yitpalelu el hamakom hazeh. And when you hear the supplications which your servant and your people Israel offer toward you, toward this place, v'atat tishma el mekom shivtecha el hashamayim, v'shama'ata v'salachta. Give your heed in your heavenly abode, give heed and pardon. So here Shelomo focuses on one particular element of prayer for forgiveness. He says when the Jewish people come to the temple, and inevitably they will come to the temple because they need to ask forgiveness for something that they have done, let their prayers be heard by God and let you grant them forgiveness through the prayers that they offer you in this Beit HaMikdash. Verse 31, Et asher yecheta ish lere'ehu v'nasabo ala leha'aloto. Whenever one man commits an offense against another, and the latter utters an imprecation to bring a curse upon him, uba ala lifnei mizbachacha b'bayit hazeh, and comes with his imprecation before your altar in this house. So if two people do wrong each other, one person wrongs another, right? And they come to the Beit HaMikdash to ask for forgiveness. Verse 32, Ve'ata tishma hashamayim ve'asita v'shafata et avadecha. O hear in heaven and take action to judge your servants. Leharshia rasha, condemning him who is wrong, latet darko berosho, and bringing down the punishment of his conduct on his head. Ulahatzdik tzadik, latet lo kitzidkato, and to vindicate he who is right by rewarding him according to his righteousness. It does sound a little bit here, and here I think it's worth addressing a quick point. It does sound like here people can come to the Beit HaMikdash to pray to God for things that they've done wrong between each other. Now that's a little surprising. Why is that surprising? Because we typically maintain that issues between man and man have to be solved between man and man. That God cannot grant forgiveness to anybody for something that they've done wrong to their fellow person, to another person. You have to ask them for forgiveness. This is a common sentiment we share around the high holidays time, right? That yes, you could stand in front of prayer and ask God, forgive me for eating unkosher, forgive me for violating Shabbat and so on, but forgive me for stealing money from my friend. I got to give the money back to my friend and I got to ask forgiveness from my friend. I don't think that what Shelomo is saying here is that a person can come to the Beit HaMikdash and ask God for forgiveness and God will grant him forgiveness between him and his friend. I don't think Shelomo is saying that. I think Shelomo full well recognizes that the solution, that the tensions between people have to be resolved amongst people. But I think what he's adding on is that there's an additional component to issues that go on between men and men. What happens when somebody wronged you and you can't get them to forgive you? What happens if somebody wronged you and there's no way to replace the money that you lost? It's just gone. What happens when there doesn't seem to be divine justice? That a person can come and pray for. A person can come to the Beit HaMikdash and feel like someone else wronged me and they said, sorry, but hey, I'm still out 100 grand. Where's my money, right? He didn't give me back the money. He stole my money and he blew it, right? Well, I'm still out and he still has it. And I don't know, something's not right here. That's when a person can come and say, God, I need justice. I need divine justice. Or someone else can come and say, God, forgive me. I did something wrong and I don't have the capability. I'm prevented from actually being able to get forgiveness. Something is not right. Hashem could then step in on the person's behalf. I think that's more what the Beit HaMikdash represents here for Shelomo. It represents a place of divine justice. It represents a place where things that you feel are wrong in the world can then be resolved through connecting with Hashem. That's where it is. And not to mention that also who resides inside of the Beit HaMikdash, the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court, also sits inside of the temple in the Beit HaMikdash, which means that the Beit HaMikdash not only serves for a place of worshiping God, but it's also the center of justice for the Jewish people. You want justice, you come to the Beit HaMikdash. And from the Beit HaMikdash radiates justice all through the society. Let's read the last two Pisukim here in the section 33 and 34, and then hopefully we'll revisit some of these issues and finish up chapter 8 in the next class. Verse 33, should your people Israel be routed by an enemy because they have sinned against you, let them turn back to you and acknowledge your name. Let them pray and beg and receive divine grace in this home. Verse 34, O hear in heaven and pardon the sin of your people Israel, and restore them to the land that you gave to their fathers. Again, I can't reiterate it enough. You're consistently seeing the theme of prayer for individual pardon and forgiveness, prayer for divine justice, prayer for national forgiveness in the face of an enemy when things go wrong. Shelomo is going to continue throughout the chapter to target different situations in which prayer is going to be the key form of how the Jewish people come to the Beit HaMikdash and serve Hashem. And sacrifice becomes the supplement towards that. One last thing that we're going to see in the next class is how Shelomo views the Beit HaMikdash as a place of prayer for all mankind, not just for the Jewish people. He looks at the Beit HaMikdash as a place that all the world's population will turn their eyes towards, and they will all come to the Beit HaMikdash to pray to God. And that is something that we certainly look forward to. Certainly revolutionary, that somebody would build something for their own religion with the intentions of uniting the entire world under that banner is something that is very unique to the religious world and something that Shelomo is going to promote in a very, very important way. And this will, Well, it will, because in the next chapter, the Queen of Sheba will travel far and wide to come and see the temple and visit Shelomo and see the society that he's produced. So Shelomo's kingdom does become a major beacon of light for all of the nations of the world. Unfortunately, it doesn't last long enough, and the nations of the world get jealous and other things like that. So, but it is important to understand that idealistically, the Beit HaMikdash is, as Yeshaya says, a Bet Tefillah Yikareh Lechol Ha'amim, a house of prayer that should be called for all the nations to be able to see. And that's an emphasis that we'll see from Shelomo in the second half of this chapter.
Does that mean that they were hoping that
No, I don't think that means they're hoping the whole world will become Jewish. I think it means that they're hoping that the entire world will recognize God. When you say become Jewish, I assume you mean observe all of the laws of the Torah. But no, Judaism is a unique religion in that it does not mandate, require, or even potentially want the entire world to be observant of all 613 mitzvot. There is a way for the other nations of the world to recognize God, observe the 7 Noahide laws, the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, and be moral societies without having to quote unquote be Jewish, right? There's the Jewish people who serve as God's model and the center, and then everything else that radiates from that. As long as the other nations acknowledge God, are monotheistic, set up moral and just societies built on the principles of the 7 Noahide laws, they have every ability to be a part of the society, to be looked at favorably by God, to be blessed by Hashem, to have a portion in the divine world, in the eternal world to come. No question about it. No question. That's something unique to Judaism. Every other religion, it's either you're in or you're out. You're either this religion or you're a heathen. Judaism doesn't believe that. And that will be front and center here in the way Shelomo inaugurated the Mikdash. We'll see more about that Be'ezrat Hashem in a couple of weeks. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.